Exactly this month, 30 years ago, to the date, as we talk, 30 years ago, people were shivering with terror in Kashmir. In their homes, they thought it was the end of the world. Mosques were blaring through their loudspeakers hateful slogans that Kashmir will turn into Pakistan without the Hindu men but with their women folk. There was a professor, Ganju, and his wife Prana Ganju. They were sitting at home when the wife showed some concern and fear that there were few boys at the door. The professor said, "No, they are my students. Let them in." And these students murdered the husband and gang raped the wife. Article 370 was an anomaly in the Constitution of India. It bled India, it drained India, India's resources. India's finest soldiers lost their lives, shed their blood defending Kashmir. It created a system in Kashmir that fostered alienation and jihad. So when in 1990 we left Kashmir again, it was the seventh time that the Hindus of Kashmir had to leave the valley of their forefathers and ancestors.
One of the most brutal genocides in recent times has been largely ignored and forgotten by the world and human rights groups. 500,000 Kashmiri Hindus were either brutally massacred or forced to flee for their lives. Their entire community were forced to abandon their businesses, homes, and all their worldly possessions. It was either leave or die. Today, in this lens, we'll hear directly from a Kashmiri activist, Sushil Pandit. He is honoring the 30th anniversary of the Kashmiri genocide by telling us in vivid detail what really happened during that horrific time.
Today, we have a very special guest, Mr. Sushil Pandit. He is a Hindu activist from Kashmir, India. He has been working on the cause for decades now. We'll be talking today on the issue that the world, human rights, and the world has turned a blind eye to the genocide of Kashmiri Hindus. Mr. Sushil Pandit, welcome to our show.
Namaskar, and thank you for having me.
Mr. Pandit, can you just tell us a little bit about your work and the situations of Kashmiri Hindus and Kashmiri Pandits? Why in 1990s Hindus leave from the valley?
Because a campaign of hatred and violence was unleashed. People were killed through targeted murders and massacres. Women were raped, temples were desecrated, homes were looted, shops, businesses simply taken over. Living became an impossibility. Safety and honor were absolutely gone. And the governments watched with apathy. Army was not deployed, police was not deployed, courts just didn't take any notice. Media turned a blind eye. The world was busy in one preoccupation or the other. Nobody cared. And an entire community of almost 500,000 population, more than 75,000 families, had to flee for their lives. Exactly this month, 30 years ago, to the date, as we talk, 30 years ago, people were shivering with terror in Kashmir. In their homes, they thought it was the end of the world. Mosques were blaring through their loudspeakers hateful slogans that Kashmir will turn into Pakistan without the Hindu men but with their women folk. That what will prevail in Kashmir is Nizam-e-Mustafa, which means the law of Sharia. So such slogans, such speeches, such huge demonstrations, mobilization of people in the street, pasting of notices on the boards, on the doors, advertisements in newspapers. On 4th and 6th of January, two newspapers, Aftab and Al Safa, carried front page advertisements asking non-Muslims to quit Kashmir. Already the icons of the community were killed in broad daylight with impunity. So there was no other option left but to leave with your old parents and young children, with your women folk, keep their honor and lives intact. Dipen, we are today on the 30th anniversary of the forced violent exodus of Kashmiri Hindus from Kashmir Valley. Kashmiri Hindus were the original inhabitants of Kashmir Valley.
So when this genocide was done, so who are the people? Who are the people responsible? Who are doing that? Were there some foreign bodies, or who are they?
No, this was, Farooq Abdullah was the chief minister of Kashmir. Mufti Muhammad Saeed was the home minister of India. Congress and National Conference ruled the state of Jammu and Kashmir together in a coalition. VP Singh ruled Delhi with support of the left bloc and the BJP. Every political party, entire political class was part of the power structure in either Delhi, which is central government, or in the state, running the state government. Everyone was complicit, everyone was involved. So nobody has the luxury of pointing fingers at the other. The entire political spectrum was part of the power structure, and they let us down in Kashmir.
Right. And how about the people who massacred Hindus, who brutally killed Hindus, who raped women? Who were they? There were allegations they were not from the valley, but from outside.
Oh no, they were very valley. An organization called Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, led by Yasin Malik and Amalullah Khan. Yasin Malik was a local boy. They initiated all this. And they were followed by Hizbul Mujahideen. These are all organizations, formations of the local population and local organizations. Yes, they went to Pakistan for training. Yes, Pakistan armed them with Kalashnikovs, grenades, rocket launchers, funds. Yes, the propaganda, the vitiation of the minds, the venom, everything was easily made available through the network of mosques and madrasas. But the hands that pulled the trigger were local. Those who shed our blood were local. Our neighbors betrayed us. Instead of helping, they pointed at the places where we were hiding for our lives. They themselves came to our homes and looted them, burnt them. They encroached on our temples.
So you are saying the neighbors that you had been living here for years and years together, and these were the people who committed this genocide. Knowing you personally, knowing their neighbors, knowing their friends and families. So these were the people who did that.
Boys we grew up playing cricket with burnt our homes. Families who lived in the neighborhood pointed to the terrorists where the man was hiding. Those who lived in the neighborhood, went to the neighborhood mosques, were the ones who mobilized people and picketed our homes and banged at our doors and pasted notices. They were the beneficiaries of our exodus also. They usurped our homes, encroached our properties, bought it at throwaway prices, having occupied them already. A large section of population either actively participated in our expulsion, in the violence unleashed on us, or were passive onlookers waiting to benefit from our exodus, taking over our businesses and homes, taking over our jobs and shops. So everyone was complicit from one degree to the other, in one manner or the other.
So when you say there were locals who had played a direct role while pulling the trigger, or somehow had a role, they have a role to play. Can you explain us a little bit more, like what kind of roles they play?
I'll tell you. There was a telecom engineer called Balkrishnan Ganju. When terrorists came for him and he happened to notice it from his second floor window, his wife asked him to hide in a rice drum on the attic. So when they came looking for him, the wife said he's not home. They searched for him all over, couldn't find him, left. As they were going away, the homes in Kashmir, being old cities, old constructions, were very close to each other. I mean,
Yeah.
if the windows are open, you could almost peep into the neighbor's home.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So the lady in the adjacent house called those terrorists who were leaving back and pointed to them that this man was hiding in the attic. So they came back, went straight to the attic, saw him in the rice drum. They didn't even let him come out of the drum. They pumped the bullets on him right there and he died. When the wife protested and said, "How will she live?" they thrust the blood-soaked rice in her mouth and said, "This is how you will live. Eat this." One of my friends, Rashni Kher, his house was looted by the boys he grew up playing cricket with in the neighborhood. There was a professor, Ganju, and his wife, Prana Ganju. They were sitting at home when the wife showed some concern and fear that there were few boys at the door. The professor said, "No, they are my students. Let them in." And these students murdered the husband and gang raped the wife. This is how trust was betrayed, relationships were torn asunder. This is how terror was unleashed. Violence of a bizarre kind, unheard of in the valley, unexpected of the people you knew, you worked for, you grew up. There was a compounder who used to serve the neighborhood with medicine, pharmacy, helping at the doctors. He was dragged from his house all the way several meters and then butchered. His limbs cut into pieces and thrown into the river. The Director General of Doordarshan, Lassa Kaul, had gone to his parents' house to meet him. He used to live in another place because of security reasons. Some of his colleagues knew where he was gone, and the killers went after him right there at the doorstep, shot him dead. So each one of these stories, there are several of them, in villages, in smaller towns, in capital city, they are heartrending. Each one chronicles the betrayal that took place in the valley, where people who knew you killed you. There was a terrorist called Bitta Karate. The first murder he committed was of his closest friend Satish Tikku, because this Satish Tikku went to meet him at his house. He heard Bitta Karate, who had disappeared for months, had come back home. So he went to meet him. This man had gone across the border for training in arms. So when he went to his house to meet him to find out why he was missing for so long, he found him handling a gun that he had in his possession. And when he left, Bitta Karate told his commander that my friend had come to pay a visit and he accidentally saw the gun that I was handling. What am I to do? So Bitta Karate says that I was told to eliminate him. So he goes to his house. His sister recognizes him. He tells the sister of Satish to send Satish down. He wanted to have a word with him. Satish came down. He stepped out of his house. Barely had he stepped out from his house, Satish Tikku was shot dead from the point blank range. He was least expecting his own friend who he had just visited a short while back to pull the trigger on him. So this is how people were murdered. Just as Neelkant Ganju was murdered and Hari Singh High Street, which is the center of the town. And this man was a retired High Court judge. Pandit Tikalal Chaplu, who was one of the most visible community leaders, political leader of the Hindu community, a lawyer who was easily accessible for any kind of help, very socially active person, was similarly shot dead, broad daylight, on a high street. So this is a tale of gory violence, mayhem, massacres, rapes. Sarla Bhatt was gang raped and thrown as a thoroughfare without a stitch on her. Girija Tikku, she had gone to collect her salary. was abducted by the neighbors, gang raped, and then while she was still alive, she was hacked on a chainsaw and the pieces of her body were thrown. A visceral hatred. Against whom? Against unarmed, non-combatant women, children, old men, hapless people who could not resist, could not defend themselves in front of Kalashnikov. You know, the point is, I have been asking for a long time, show me one case of a Hindu killing a Muslim, even one as an exception of counter violence or even the violence.
In the valley. Uh-huh.
Not even one, ever.
So all this hatred, the entire genocide, the brutal killings and violence and rape just in the name of religion.
Yes, we paid the price because we were Hindus. We were singled out because we were not only not Muslims, we were also patriots. Movement was to break India and take Kashmir out of it. Hindus, we were patriots. We couldn't have betrayed our country. And hence, because we were the original inhabitants, we were all over the valley. We knew every square inch of the valley. We knew the language. We knew the people. We knew the terrain. Such mischief wasn't possible while we were around. Had we converted to Islam, we could have lived there happily with all our possessions intact. But we refused. So we were mercilessly hunted, killed, and driven out.
As you mentioned, there were also mosques they had been used. So how were these things? The mosque and everything was involved in that.
Yes, of course. Mosques were the nerve center of such mobilization. They used their loudspeakers, they used their places for gathering people, for instructions, for taking decisions, for drawing out the targets, the hit lists. Those were the places where this was planned, responsibilities given, and execution carried out. These were the hubs from where this entire jihad was unleashed.
And after that, once the Hindus left the valley, so what happened to them? Was there any assistance, or how had they been living?
It was peak of winters. You know, this month is the coldest month in Kashmir every year.
Right.
And the community had to live with what they had on themselves. The clothes they wore or whatever little money they could carry in their pockets. They could not pack their bags even.
Mm.
And in that condition, fleeing for their lives, they landed in the temples and dharmshalas of Jammu. People opened their homes. It is a winter break, so schools and whatever places were available. Population of Jammu almost grew twofold overnight because such a huge exodus took place. Go downs, shops, pavements, temples, anything and everything was used to somehow accommodate families, women, children, old men and women. And then hurriedly, some tented townships were put together in the outskirts on very inhospitable terrains that were full of snakes and scorpions, with no water, no sanitation, no electricity. People who'd never, and then within few months when the summer came, Jammu summers are very severe. The temperature goes beyond 40-45 degrees.
Oh, really?
Those who were not used to living in such temperatures, because Kashmir temperature barely rises above 30.
Right.
Kashmir, you sleep with a quilt through the year.
Right.
It is that cold. Temperature drops to single digits at night, irrespective of the season. So people just couldn't take it. A lot of people died of the shock and trauma. People got stress diabetes. People took all kinds of illnesses. Some people just went mad. People committed suicide, got different kinds of diseases. So it was a horrific condition. And this condition continued year after year, decade after decade. Because what India was trying to do in Kashmir, on one hand, it was battling the armed insurgency, violent jihad. On the other hand, it was trying to win hearts and minds. Because they were winning hearts and minds of the local population, asking questions about what did you do to Kashmiri Hindus was not considered viable, because
Right.
that would have come in the way of winning hearts and minds.
Right. Right. Uh-huh.
So we were sacrificed at the altar of winning hearts and minds in Kashmir. We were shoved under the carpet.
Right. Hindu basically paid the cost of the negotiation, rather.
Yes, we were shoved under the carpet. There was a whitewashing of this genocide. People like Yasin Malik and Bitta Karate, who boasted of massacres, who bragged about killing, roamed free. Till date, not even one murder has been prosecuted, the culprit identified, or anyone sentenced. Not even one murder or rape. Not even one heinous crime of this genocide has been tried in a court of law and punished.
But when you say Yasin Malik, just for the listeners and the audience who are watching this, can you tell a little bit more about him? Because he was a very well-known personality on all the platforms and in India, Pakistan, and several international platforms, living a very lavish life as far as
Yeah.
we know. So can you tell a little bit about him or people? There were other people like him too.
So Yasin Malik was a school dropout, a street urchin who lived in the neighborhood called Maisuma of Srinagar. Because he led JKLF and had a band of terrorists at his beck and call, he unleashed the most violent campaign Kashmir had seen ever. He was one of the primary shakers and movers of our genocide. He also killed a squadron leader, Ravi Khanna of Indian Air Force, serving squadron leader, and 4 airmen, point blank range, unarmed, uniformed personnel waiting for their staff bus to go to their jobs early in the morning. He was the one who was responsible for the abduction of Sarla Bhatt and her gang rape. He was the one responsible for killing of Justice Neelkant Ganju and Tikalal Taplu. He was the one responsible for killing of Advocate Premnath Bhatt and Lassa Kaul, the Director General of Doordarshan. He was one of the persons responsible for killing of Sarvanand Kaul Premi, one of the scholars of Kashmir and a poet. So this man, when Pakistan lost confidence in him and JKLF, they propped up another organization called Hizbul Mujahideen, and there was some kind of a struggle between the two organizations for supremacy. Yasin Malik grandiosely called off his violent struggle because he was actually disarmed by Pakistan, and he took a tactical decision, political struggle. Government of India thought of tapping him, and almost in an unwritten, informal manner, stopped all prosecution. There were more than 24 FIRs against him for various violent acts. All cases stopped, including the murder of squadron leader Ravi Khanna, an Air Force officer. And incidentally, that case was running under a TADA court. Even that case stopped. Governments came and went, prime ministers came and went, but there was a consensus across the political class not to prosecute and punish them. If you and I apply for a passport, we will be asked several questions about our criminal record. This man, who was self-confessed murderer, was not only given a passport, but government actively intervened for him to get a US visa. In
Really?
2002, he came to US ostensibly to get treated for his ailments, but he was healthy and strong enough to visit from one campus to the other, bad-mouthing India, while he was traveling to US on Indian government's money. This man was allowed to go to Pakistan several times. He went and got married to a Pakistani woman. He also has a child from her. So this man who caused a genocide in Kashmir was funded, secured, looked after, his bills paid, his travel bills, his hotel bills, his fuel bills. He had a retinue of security men which would put to shame even heads of the states. He would get invitation from Pakistan High Commission to participate in their national days, and he would come specially from Kashmir to Delhi to go to their High Commission. You had to see his cavalcade from the airport to the Pakistani High Commission. It rivaled any cavalcade of a head of a state. The prime ministers invited him for breakfasts and lunches and would happily photograph themselves with him. This was the irony. We have seen these things in the last 30 years. Such was the treatment of our genocide and of our exodus in the last 30 years.
So Kashmir Valley is predominantly Muslim. So was it always like that? Or what is the history of Kashmiri Hindus related to the valley?
Our presence in the valley goes back several thousand years, and there is documented history of our being there. In fact, we have a lore where the dry land of Kashmir Valley was retrieved from a high mountain lake called Satisara several ages back. Maharshi Kashyap helped in draining out the waters of Satisara in order to vanquish a very troublesome asura, Daitya, called Jalodbhava. And with his elimination, extremely violent and very troublesome demon who used to harass the rishis and munis, who would contemplate and sit on the slopes of Himalayas near the edge of that big lake, sought help of Maharshi Kashyap, and as a result, Jalodbhav was eliminated. By draining the waters of that lake, the dry land emerged, and a plural society comprising Gandharvas, Kinnaras, Pishachas, Nagas, Brahmins, and a whole host of other communities started off Kashmir. This is the lore in Nilmat Puran, and that is how Kashmir started. For several thousand years, even during the Mahabharata period, the king of Kashmir was mentioned. Prabhu Sri Krishna's visit to Kashmir is mentioned. Coronation of the first ever woman ruler in the world, Maharani Yashomati, is mentioned. So Kashmir is part of our lore, is part of Kashmir's creation and the beginning of a plural society there.
Mm-hmm.
This Kashmiri indigenous society was subjected to untold misery, pain, torture, and huge violence, humiliation, because Islam wanted to wipe out that civilization, that culture, by either converting or killing or simply expelling. These were the three options left for our forefathers. And this continuous onslaught for almost 5 centuries led to 100% Hindu Bauddha population of Kashmir, whittling down to barely double digits at the end of these 5 centuries. Successive rulers of Shamsuddin dynasty, Mughals, Pathans, waged a war on the indigenous identity of Kashmir. Earlier 6 occasions were in the medieval times, when there was no concept of human rights or constitution, when there was no democracy, when we suffered an alien rule that was violent, tyrannical. It is the 7th exodus of 1990 that pains the most, because it happened when we had an army of our own, when we were under a democratic, secular, socialist order, when there was an elected prime minister, when there was a fully fledged parliament comprising more than 800 member parliaments, when there was a United Nations and a declaration of international human rights, when we had a system of courts, police, a criminal justice system. None of this was there when 6 exoduses happened, so you could somehow console yourself. But the 7th exodus happened when all of it was around. And we had 900 million population of our country. We were not even fragmented into small states who didn't care for each other. It is in such conditions that in 1990 Kashmir was emptied out of Hindus yet again. So when in 1990 we left Kashmir again, it was the seventh time that the Hindus of Kashmir had to leave the valley of their forefathers and ancestors.
So now, when things you see things a little bit had changed, especially after the abrogation of Article 370 and stuff like that. Article 370 also took out Article 35A, obviously. So how do you look at the situation now? Is it something to be happy about for Kashmiri Hindus? It could be done reverse what has done happened in 1990.
I don't think this has any direct bearing on we went through in 1990. Article 370 was an anomaly in the Constitution of India. It shouldn't have been there in the first place. It bled India. It drained India, India's resources. India's finest soldiers lost their lives, shed their blood defending Kashmir. It created a system in Kashmir that fostered alienation and jihad. So what India did on August 5 was a favor to itself, not to anybody else.
Right.
It did itself a favor because this system was unsustainable. We had tried every possible way of appeasing Kashmir, pleasing Kashmir in the last 30 years, in fact 70 years. Jammu Kashmir's population was barely 1% of the total Indian population. But central government spent year after year, decade after decade, 10% of its central funds in Kashmir. Kashmiris were treated with kid gloves. They were given preferential prices for essential commodities. Kashmir was given a special dispensation. Parliament could not legislate on Kashmir. Indian constitution did not apply in Kashmir. Supreme Court had no jurisdiction for years. Election Commission had no jurisdiction. Kashmir's politicians were given a free rein to do as they please. They lined their pockets. They misused this autonomy. And they repaid India back by creating a venomous hatred against India among the successive generations in Kashmir, all under the autonomy guaranteed by 370. So what India did on 5th of August was a favor to itself to knock at the very foundation of such a system, inimical system, hostile system that bred alienation, that bred jihad. Now we were the victims of this pernicious system.
Yeah.
We were the first casualty of this pernicious system because there was an open and brazen discrimination practiced against us in terms of jobs, in terms of education, in terms of social profiling, and we paid the price for being Hindus and for being patriots. Article 370 will set a lot of things right, and hopefully, as we progress, may also pave the way for our return home if everything goes well and government does not succumb to the pressure of trying to restore a semblance of normalcy in a hurry and not go the right way, the long way, but create a shortcut, make a rehash of the same old discredited politicians of Kashmir in order to put together some ragtag system in its desperation to declare normalcy. If we do not succumb to such pressures, if we put our head down and painstakingly dismantle the edifice of jihad, root and branch, only then I think we have a hope of restoring Kashmir back to its pristine health.
When you mentioned, while you're talking, you also mentioned that it has been happening for a very long period of time, since the time of independence. So do you think that what happened in 1990 was something all of a sudden, or it has been happening, the discrimination or anti-Hindu sentiments or anti-Hindu activities has been going on for a long time.
Of course, in 1947, when Sheikh Abdullah was foisted on us
Mm.
and he was given a carte blanche, a complete free run of Kashmir to do as he pleased, he started to put together a bigoted communal system that favored Muslims over every other identity and favored the valley over every other region. There was a huge discrimination suffered by Ladakh and Jammu in terms of regional disparities. And there was huge discrimination suffered by non-Muslims, most of which were Hindus, we Hindus of Kashmir Valley. And this led to Hindus trickling out of valley for pursuit of their education and jobs. Because survival there was untenable. Hostility and discrimination were extremely high. What happened in 1990 was that it turned the trickle into a flood. Earlier, it was socio-economic and political discrimination that was leading this trickle to leave Kashmir. In 1990, open threat to the very lives led to all of us flooding out of Kashmir.
Or do you think there is certain hope for getting a justice? Or do you think the justice, do you see any way of getting the justice?
Very good question. I think the very first step towards justice would be to acknowledge what happened with us. We are called migrants. We are called displaced. In fact, we are victims of a genocide.
True.
I don't know why there is hesitation in acknowledging this basic fact. I understand, yes, it puts a question mark on the system as to how it allowed it. It embarrasses the governments, successive governments, who have shirked away from acknowledging it, and therefore also puts them in the dock. But a genocide it was, and a genocide denied is genocide multiplied.
True. Yes.
So you must first of all acknowledge what happened to us in 1990 as the very first prerequisite. It is an imperative. And when you recognize it, acknowledge it, only then will you do something about it in terms of delivering justice. Those who perpetrated this genocide should be tried under a genocide convention. There should be special tribunals and fast-track courts to dispense the justice. The victims and survivors of this genocide have been waiting for decades and justice has not been delivered. So that is the second step after acknowledgement, which is the first step. Deliver justice. Third, there are a huge number of beneficiaries of this genocide who encroached our properties, who bought them dirt cheap because we were in a distress for money. They feasted on it like scavenging birds, like vultures. Nobody should be allowed to profit from a genocide. There should be a law to recover those properties. You know, immovable properties have a documented record. I'm not talking about movable wealth, which is difficult to retrieve. But at least immovable properties have a documentary record. There should be a legislation to recover the properties that went exchanged hands in distress sales or which were simply encroached upon and taken away from these profiteers, those who profited from the genocide, and reverted to their original rightful owners. They should be paid compensation. Not a dime of compensation has been paid in the last 30 years.
Right. Right.
And fourth, logical corollary from these three steps is that we should be restored in our lands in Kashmir. At one place, we want to rebuild our community without the risk of refoulement, which means when we go there never to ever face such a threat in generations to come. Foolproof guarantees of security and safety and honor. So these are the four steps that I think are imperative, are necessary for anyone in the community to feel that justice has been done
Okay.
and a genocide has been reversed.
Before we end this conversation, I know there are several topics to talk on, but due to constraint of time, before we end this topic, what would be your message as a Kashmiri Pandit, as a Kashmiri Hindu, to people who are not Indians and do not know anything about genocide of Kashmir, might be Westerners or any part of the world, who do not know, as this genocide is been never talked about, and the blind has been turned by the entire human rights organization throughout the world. What would be your message to anyone who is listening to this?
I can only say that what we have faced in Kashmir, the world is facing at several other places as we talk. The world has to do itself a favor and not hide behind political correctness, not prevaricate. You have to acknowledge what is happening to us in Kashmir for the last 30 years. It happened to us in 1990 and everyone turned their backs on us. But when it happened in 1999 in Kosovo, NATO planes took off from Italy and bombed the civilian inhabitation for more than 20 days. From March 20th to April 10, the world saw NATO planes bombing Kosovo when a much smaller population was turned out by the Serbs. At that time, the victims were Muslims, and the entire world got together to restore them into their homes. This time, the population was Hindu. I didn't even see any protest. I didn't see any reports. I didn't see any petitions. I didn't see any campaign. I didn't even see any court judgment. I didn't see any strictures. I didn't see any politician hanging his head in shame, taking responsibility and doing something about it. I saw a lot of people exploiting this issue for scoring debating points or for mobilizing voters to vote in one direction or the other. But I didn't see any real redressal on the ground. If this goes unattended and unaddressed, I'm afraid we are in for many more such genocides waiting to happen. So don't do us a favor, do yourself a favor, and please address this situation as it deserves to be addressed.
So thank you very much for joining us and giving your time. It was indeed a pleasure to talk to you, and obviously an honor to talk to you.
I'm so happy that we talked today, and thank you so much for taking the time out, making this effort. I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Terror and grief in this remote village in Indian-controlled Kashmir after 24 Hindus were dragged from their homes and massacred. Suspected Islamic militants in army uniforms forced them out of their homes, lined them up in front of a Hindu temple and shot them at close range. It's the biggest ever terrorist attack on the state's minority. The corpses of 2 children, 11 men and 11 women, lined up side by side, were surrounded by nearly 2,000 relatives who'd come from other villages to mourn their dead. This was the last chance for relatives to see their kin before cremation. For some, it all seemed too much to bear. Tens of thousands of Hindus have fled the region after Islamic militants began targeting them as part of their fight for an independent Kashmiri state. Many live in refugee camps outside Indian cities. And after last night's attack, there are many in this village who regret having stayed on.
Please subscribe to our channel and do not forget to hit the bell icon.